By the time the police arrived, the house on Willow Creek Drive was silent again. The patrol car's headlights swept across the quiet Sacramento suburb just after sunrise on an early spring morning in March 1990. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Identical single-story homes, trimmed lawns, bicycles leaning against fences. It was the kind of place where people left their porch lights on all night and waved to neighbors they barely knew. But inside 214 Willow Creek Drive, something terrible had happened. Officer Tom Gallagher stepped onto the porch after a worried neighbor called 911. The front door was slightly open. He knocked. No answer. "Sacramento police," he called into the house. Still nothing. Gallagher pushed the door open slowly. The living room looked undisturbed. A couch, a television set, wedding photos on a shelf. A faint smell hung in the air, metallic and unmistakable. He followed it down the hallway. The bedroom door was half open, and when he stepped inside, he stopped cold. On the bed lay Mark and Emily Carter, both 26 years old, married less than a year. The sheets were soaked dark with blood. The room showed signs of a struggle, but not much. Whatever had happened had been fast. Gallagher stepped back into the hallway and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we've got 2 deceased." Within minutes, the quiet street filled with police cars and detectives. Yellow tape went up around the small white house as neighbors gathered in stunned silence on the sidewalk. Detectives moved carefully through the scene. No broken windows, no forced entry. The killer had somehow gotten inside quietly during the night. Mark Carter had worked as a mechanic at a local auto shop. Emily was a receptionist at a dental office. According to neighbors, the couple had moved into the house only 3 months earlier. They were exactly the kind of people who belonged in a neighborhood like this. Young, quiet, starting their lives. Detective Michael Reynolds arrived an hour later and stood in the bedroom doorway, studying the scene. "Robbery?" a uniformed officer asked. Reynolds shook his head slowly. "Nothing's missing." Wallets were still on the dresser. Emily's purse sat untouched on a chair. Jewelry remained in a small box beside the bed. This wasn't a burglary. Someone had come into the house for only one reason. Outside, crime scene technicians photographed footprints in the damp soil beside the side fence. The back gate stood slightly open. Whoever had done this had likely entered from the yard. A neighbor, an older woman named Linda Foster, spoke quietly with an officer near the patrol car. "I saw someone earlier this week," she said nervously. "A man sitting in a truck down the street." "What kind of truck?" the officer asked. "Old, dark-colored, maybe a pickup." "Did you see his face?" She shook her head. "No, he just sat there for a long time, watching the houses." The officer wrote it down, but at the time it didn't seem important. Cars passed through neighborhoods every day. Still, Detective Reynolds stood in the driveway, staring down Willow Creek Drive. Something about the scene bothered him. This hadn't been random. Someone had come to that house knowing exactly who lived inside. And somewhere, not far away, a man who had spent days watching the Carters was already driving toward another town in California, looking for his next couple. 3 days after the murders on Willow Creek Drive, the story was already fading from the front pages of Sacramento newspapers. For most people, it had become another tragic headline. A young couple killed in their home, a police investigation underway, few answers. In 1990, California was a big state with plenty of crime, and attention rarely stayed on one case for long. But hundreds of miles south on Highway 99, the man responsible for the killings was already gone. His name was Daniel Davis. He was 35 years old, tall and thin, with short brown hair that he kept neatly trimmed. Nothing about him stood out. If someone passed him at a gas station or a grocery store, they would forget his face within minutes. That was exactly how he liked it. Daniel drove an aging dark blue Ford pickup, the kind commonly used by construction workers and farm laborers throughout California's Central Valley. The truck was dusty, the paint faded by years of sun. Inside the cab sat a folded road map of California, a thermos of coffee, and a small toolbox behind the seat. To anyone who asked, Daniel said he worked temporary construction jobs. Sometimes he stayed in cheap roadside motels. Other times he rented small rooms for a few weeks at a time before moving on. It was the perfect life for someone who didn't want to be remembered. By late afternoon, he pulled into a small diner outside Fresno. The parking lot was half full with pickup trucks and sedans. Farm workers and truck drivers filled the booths inside. Daniel sat alone near the window, drinking black coffee and watching the street. Across the road stood a quiet residential block. Modest houses with small yards, driveways, and freshly planted trees. Families lived there, people who had recently moved in, starting new lives. Daniel watched carefully. His eyes moved slowly from house to house, studying details most people never noticed. A car leaving in the morning, a porch light turning off at night, a window sometimes left slightly open. But most important of all, who lived there? Daniel wasn't interested in everyone. He was looking for couples, young couples, people just beginning their lives together. He noticed them the moment they came out of the small blue house across the street that evening. The man was carrying grocery bags. The woman followed behind him, laughing about something. They looked relaxed, comfortable in that easy way people do when they've recently fallen into a routine together. Daniel watched them walk inside. A few minutes later, the lights came on in the kitchen. He checked his watch. Then he took out a small notepad from his jacket and wrote down a few simple observations. 2 occupants, male and female, both mid-20s. Returned home around 6:15 p.m. Daniel finished his coffee slowly. From the outside, nothing about what he was doing looked strange. A man sitting in a diner booth, killing time at the end of a workday. But in his mind, the process had already begun. He would watch the house for several days, learn their routine, understand when they slept, when they left, when the neighborhood became quiet. Daniel never rushed these things. Patience made everything easier. As the sun disappeared behind the rooftops of Fresno, Daniel walked calmly back to his pickup truck. Across the street, the lights in the blue house glowed warmly through the windows. Inside, the young couple had no idea someone had already chosen them. And in a few nights, when the neighborhood was asleep and the streets were empty, Daniel Davis would quietly step out of his truck, walk across the dark lawn, and enter their home. The neighborhood was quiet after midnight. On Pine Ridge Street in Fresno, the houses sat in neat rows under the dim glow of streetlights. The air carried the faint smell of orange groves from farms outside the city. Most windows were dark now. The last television sets had been turned off hours earlier. It was the kind of neighborhood where people believed nothing bad ever happened. Parked half a block away, a dark blue pickup truck sat motionless beneath a large elm tree. Inside the truck, Daniel Davis watched the house. He had been watching it for 4 nights. He knew their routine now. The couple who lived there were Kevin and Laura Bennett, both 25 years old. Kevin worked as an electrician and left the house every morning just before 7. Laura worked part-time at a bookstore downtown. They had moved into the small blue house only 2 months earlier. Daniel had seen them laughing in the yard, carrying boxes inside, planting flowers near the porch. They looked happy, exactly the kind of couple he always chose. Tonight the house went dark at 11:18 p.m. Daniel waited. Patience had always been his greatest strength. He checked his watch again at 1:07 a.m. Now the street was completely silent. No passing cars, no lights switching on in neighboring houses. Slowly, Daniel stepped out of the pickup. The cool night air felt still as he walked toward the house. His boots made almost no sound on the sidewalk. He had already studied the yard carefully during the past few days. He knew exactly where to go. The side gate opened with a soft creak. Daniel paused, listened. Nothing. He moved along the side of the house until he reached the back window he had noticed earlier in the week. On warm evenings, Laura often left it slightly open while cooking dinner. Tonight it was the same. Daniel slid the window upward just enough to climb through. Inside, the kitchen was dark. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The faint red glow of the digital clock on the stove read 1:14 a.m. The house smelled faintly of laundry detergent and fresh paint. Daniel moved quietly down the hallway. The bedroom door was closed. Inside, Kevin and Laura Bennett were asleep. Daniel placed his hand on the doorknob and slowly turned it. The door opened with a soft click. The room was almost completely dark except for thin moonlight filtering through the blinds. The couple slept peacefully beneath the covers, unaware of the figure standing in the doorway. For a brief moment, Daniel simply watched them. This was always the moment he felt the strange calm that came before everything else. Then he stepped forward. The attack happened fast. A sudden noise woke Kevin first, confusion in his voice as he tried to sit up. Laura gasped in the darkness. Within seconds, the quiet house erupted into chaos. Then just as quickly as it began, it was over. Minutes later, the bedroom was silent again. Daniel wiped his hands carefully with a cloth he had brought with him. He moved through the house quickly, making sure nothing had been disturbed more than necessary. He didn't take anything. He never did. That wasn't why he came. At 1:32 a.m., Daniel climbed back through the kitchen window and crossed the dark yard toward the street. The pickup started quietly. As he drove away, the house on Pine Ridge Street looked peaceful again under the streetlights. Inside, the bodies of Kevin and Laura Bennett lay in their bedroom. The second young couple murdered in their own home. And hundreds of miles away in Sacramento, Detective Michael Reynolds was about to receive a phone call about a crime scene that looked disturbingly familiar. By early summer of 1990, the murders had begun to spread across California's Central Valley. At first, no one connected them. Police departments in different cities handled their own investigations, filing reports, collecting evidence, and searching for suspects. Each case looked tragic, brutal, but isolated, until the third couple was found. This time it happened in Stockton, nearly 90 miles north of Fresno. On a warm June morning, a paperboy riding his bicycle down Cedar Lane noticed the front door of a small beige house standing open. Newspapers had been piling up on the porch for 2 days. He knocked. No one answered. An hour later, police officers forced their way inside and discovered Jason and Nicole Ramirez, both 27 years old, lying in their bedroom. Like the previous victims, they had been attacked during the night. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. The house looked almost untouched. Detective Angela Morales, who was assigned to the case in Stockton, noticed the same strange detail Sacramento detectives had seen months earlier. The killer had moved quietly, carefully. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to go. Still, without communication between departments, the case stalled. Leads disappeared. Witnesses had seen nothing. Then in August 1990, it happened again, this time in Modesto. The victims were Brian and Melissa Turner, newly married and living in a small rental house near the edge of town. Brian worked at a tire shop. Melissa was finishing community college. Neighbors described them as the perfect young couple. They had been dead for less than 12 hours when police found them, and again the details were almost identical. Nighttime attack, young married couple, no forced entry, nothing stolen. By now, whispers had begun spreading quietly among detectives in the region. 4 couples, 4 different cities, all within a few hundred miles. It was Detective Michael Reynolds in Sacramento who first started laying the files side by side on his desk. He had never forgotten the case on Willow Creek Drive. Something about it had bothered him from the start. When he received the report from Fresno describing the Bennett murders months earlier, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Now Stockton and Modesto had their own nearly identical crime scenes. Reynolds stared at the photographs spread across his desk. 4 bedrooms, 4 couples, 4 silent houses where someone had entered in the middle of the night. He circled details in red pen. Young couples, recently moved into their homes, no theft, entry without visible break-in. The pattern was beginning to form. Late one evening in his office, Reynolds leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. If he was right, this wasn't a string of unrelated murders. This was something much worse. Somewhere in California, a man was traveling from city to city, watching houses, studying couples, waiting until the neighborhood went quiet, then entering their homes while they slept. Reynolds picked up the phone and began calling other police departments across the Central Valley: Fresno, Stockton, Modesto. By the time he hung up 2 hours later, the same uneasy conclusion had begun forming in every detective's mind. They weren't dealing with separate killers. They were dealing with one man, a man who had already murdered 4 couples. And as Detective Reynolds stared at the photographs again, another thought crept slowly into his mind. If the killer was still out there, then somewhere in California, another young couple might already be under observation, and the man watching them was patient. By September 1990, the pattern could no longer be ignored. 4 young couples murdered in 4 different cities across California's Central Valley. The similarities between the crime scenes were too precise to dismiss as coincidence. For the first time, detectives from Sacramento, Fresno, Stockton, and Modesto sat together in the same room. The meeting took place inside a plain conference room at the Sacramento Police Department. Case files, photographs, and reports covered the long wooden table. Detective Michael Reynolds stood at the front of the room beside a large map of California. Colored pins marked the locations of the murders: Sacramento, Fresno, Stockton, Modesto. The pattern stretched along the corridor of Highway 99, the long north-south highway running through the Central Valley. Reynolds tapped the map with a pen. "He's moving," he said. The room was silent. Detective Angela Morales from Stockton crossed her arms. "You're saying one man did all of these?" Reynolds nodded. "Same victim profile, same method, same entry pattern. No forced break-ins, no theft." He pointed to the crime scene photos laid out on the table. Every victim was a young married couple. All of them moved into their homes within the last 6 months. Another detective flipped through the files slowly. "So what's his motive?" Reynolds shook his head. "That's the problem. There's no obvious one. If the killer wanted money, he would have taken it. If he wanted revenge, the victims would have known him. But every couple had been strangers to each other. They lived in different cities, worked different jobs, had completely separate lives. The only thing they shared was that they were young couples starting a life together." Detective Morales leaned forward. "Which means he's choosing them." Reynolds nodded again. "He's watching them first." That realization shifted the entire investigation. The killer wasn't breaking into random houses. He was selecting victims ahead of time, studying them, learning their routines. Outside the conference room window, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the police parking lot. Inside, the detectives began building their theory. The killer likely traveled often, maybe for work, construction, agriculture, truck driving, something that allowed him to move easily between cities. And somewhere along the way, he spotted couples that caught his attention. Another officer spoke up. "What about witnesses?" Reynolds opened a small notebook. "There was one in Sacramento," he said. "A neighbor reported seeing a dark pickup truck parked on the street days before the Carters were killed." He flipped another page. "Fresno had something similar. A delivery driver said he noticed a truck sitting near Pine Ridge Street for several nights." The room grew quiet again. 2 sightings. Same kind of vehicle. Detective Morales exhaled slowly. "So we're looking for a man driving a pickup truck who travels along Highway 99. Reynolds nodded. "It's not much, but it's a start." That evening, the departments officially formed a joint task force. Officers began compiling lists of registered pickup trucks across the region. Gas station attendants were questioned. Motel managers were asked about long-term guests. Every small detail was recorded. But while the police worked late into the night building their investigation, the man they were looking for was already in another town. On the edge of Visalia, parked in the gravel lot of a roadside motel, Daniel Davis sat inside his truck, studying another quiet residential street. Across the road, a small yellow house glowed warmly under the porch light. Inside lived another young married couple. Daniel had been watching them for 3 days. And while detectives across California were finally beginning to understand the killer they were hunting, they were still one step behind him. By the fall of 1990, the investigation had grown into one of the most unsettling cases in California's Central Valley. 4 couples had already been murdered. Detectives across multiple cities now believed they were hunting a traveling serial killer, someone methodical, patient, and careful enough to avoid leaving behind clear evidence. But what they didn't know was that the killer was already preparing his next move. On the outskirts of Visalia, a quiet residential neighborhood sat beneath rows of tall oak trees. The streets were calm, lined with modest houses and small yards where children played during the day. At night, it was silent. For nearly a week, Daniel Davis had parked his pickup truck at different points around the neighborhood, careful not to stay in one place too long. He had chosen the house 3 days earlier. The couple who lived there were Eric and Hannah Collins, both 24. Eric worked at a local auto parts warehouse, while Hannah was a nursing student at a nearby college. Daniel had watched them every evening. He knew when Eric came home from work. He knew when the lights in the house turned off. And he knew that sometimes when the weather was warm, they left the small kitchen window unlocked. Just after 1 a.m., the street was empty. Daniel stepped out of the pickup and walked quietly across the lawn toward the back of the house. Everything felt familiar now. The silence, the slow approach, the moment before entering. He moved through the yard and slipped through the same kitchen window he had noticed days earlier. Inside, the house was dark. The hallway led directly toward the bedroom. Daniel opened the door slowly. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood had witnessed another brief, violent disturbance that no one fully heard, and then it was over. The house fell silent again. But this time, something went wrong. As Daniel left through the backyard and walked toward the street, a porch light suddenly switched on 2 houses down. A man stepped outside wearing a robe, squinting into the darkness. His name was Robert Keller, a 48-year-old mechanic who often woke up in the middle of the night for a cigarette. He saw the figure walking quickly across the yard. "Hey!" Keller called out. The man didn't answer. Instead, he kept walking toward the street. Keller watched as the stranger climbed into a dark pickup truck parked near the corner. The engine started. The truck drove away. Keller stood there for a moment, confused. Something about the situation felt wrong. He memorized what he could see in the dim streetlight, the shape of the vehicle, the faded paint, and part of the license plate. He didn't know it yet, but he had just seen the man responsible for 5 murders. The next morning, police discovered the bodies of Eric and Hannah Collins inside their home. The crime scene looked painfully familiar. Young couple, nighttime attack, no forced entry, nothing stolen. But this time, when detectives canvassed the neighborhood, Robert Keller stepped forward. "I saw someone leaving the house around 1 in the morning," he told the officers. Detective Michael Reynolds leaned forward immediately. "What did you see?" Keller described the truck, dark-colored, older model pickup, parked near the corner. And then he mentioned the most important detail. "I caught part of the license plate," he said slowly. Reynolds felt the first real surge of momentum the case had seen in months. For the first time since the killings began, the mysterious man traveling across California had made a mistake, and that mistake had just given the police their first real lead. The partial license plate changed everything. For months, detectives had been chasing shadows, crime scenes with almost no evidence, witnesses who saw nothing, and a killer who seemed to vanish between cities. Now they had something real. Detective Michael Reynolds sat in front of a cluttered desk at the Sacramento Police Department, staring at the notepad where Robert Keller's statement had been written. 3 characters from a license plate, a dark, older model pickup truck. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start narrowing the search. Within days, the Joint Task Force began working with the California Department of Motor Vehicles. Officers requested records of pickup trucks registered across counties along the Highway 99 corridor. Thousands of vehicles appeared in the database, but Reynolds knew the killer's pattern now. The truck likely belonged to someone who traveled frequently, someone who moved between cities without raising suspicion, possibly a construction worker, a farm laborer, or someone who took temporary jobs. They began filtering the list. Dark-colored pickups, older models, registered to men who lived alone or moved frequently between addresses. The list slowly shrank. Still, it took weeks. Meanwhile, news of the killings had begun spreading through newspapers and local television reports. Journalists were now openly referring to the unknown suspect as the Central Valley Night Killer. Communities grew nervous. Young couples began locking doors and installing extra lights outside their homes. Police departments increased nighttime patrols in residential neighborhoods. But the killer had gone quiet. There had been no new murders for nearly 6 weeks. At first, detectives wondered if the attention had scared him off. Reynolds wasn't convinced. Killers like this rarely stopped on their own. They paused. They waited. Then they started again. One evening in late October 1990, the investigation finally produced a name. An analyst working through the DMV list noticed something unusual about one registration. The truck matched the description: an older dark blue Ford pickup. The owner was a man named Daniel Davis, 35 years old. What caught the analyst's attention wasn't just the vehicle. It was Davis's history of addresses. Over the past 2 years, he had lived, briefly, in Sacramento, Fresno, Stockton, and Modesto, every city connected to the murders. The information reached Detective Reynolds the next morning. He read through the file slowly. Daniel Davis. Age 35. Occupation: temporary construction laborer. Current address: a small rented house on the outskirts of Bakersfield. Reynolds placed the folder down and looked across the table at Detective Angela Morales. "This can't be a coincidence," she said quietly. Reynolds nodded. Every city, every timeline, every movement. The pattern fit too perfectly, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed evidence, real evidence. So the task force made a decision. Instead of moving in immediately, they would watch him. Surveillance teams were quietly sent to Bakersfield. 2 unmarked cars parked down the street from Davis's rented house. Detectives rotated shifts, observing his movements. At first, Daniel Davis appeared completely ordinary. He left early in the morning for construction work. He bought groceries at a local market. He returned home in the evening. Nothing about his routine suggested the man they were hunting, but Reynolds knew better. He had studied the crime scenes too long. One night, just before midnight, a surveillance officer watched Davis leave his house and climb into the dark blue pickup truck. The engine started. The truck pulled slowly onto the road. The officer grabbed the radio. "Unit 3 to Reynolds," he said. "Your guy just left the house." Across the city, Detective Reynolds picked up the receiver. "Where's he headed?" The officer watched the truck disappear down the street. "Residential area," he replied. Reynolds felt a cold realization settle in his chest. After 6 weeks of silence, the killer might finally be hunting again. And this time, the police were right behind him. The radio inside the unmarked car crackled softly as the surveillance team followed the pickup through the quiet streets of Bakersfield. It was just after 11:40 p.m. The dark blue Ford pickup moved slowly through a residential neighborhood, its headlights gliding across rows of modest homes. Porch lights glowed softly on a few houses, but most of the street was dark. Detective Michael Reynolds drove 2 blocks behind, careful not to get too close. "Keep your distance," he said into the radio. "Don't spook 'em." Ahead of them, Daniel Davis turned onto a narrow street lined with small single-story houses. The truck rolled to a stop near the corner beneath a street lamp. Then the headlights switched off. Inside the surveillance car, the officer raised binoculars. "He's still in the truck," the officer whispered. Minutes passed, then 10 more. Davis didn't move. Reynolds knew exactly what he was doing. Watching, studying, looking for the same things he had looked for in Sacramento, Fresno, Stockton, Modesto, Visalia. Lights turning off, neighborhoods going quiet, couples going to sleep. At 12:18 a.m., the truck door opened. Davis stepped out. He looked up and down the street calmly, like someone stretching his legs after a long drive. Then he began walking slowly along the sidewalk. The detectives watched him approach a small white house halfway down the block. The porch light was off. One window glowed faintly from inside. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. "He's picking a house," he said quietly into the radio. Davis walked past the house once, then again. On the third pass, he stopped beside the yard and looked toward the side of the building, exactly the way witnesses had described at previous crime scenes. Reynolds didn't hesitate anymore. "All units move in," he said. The silence of the neighborhood shattered as 2 unmarked cars rolled forward at the same time. Headlights snapped on. Tires crunched against the pavement. Daniel Davis froze. For the first time since the killings began, the man who had moved silently through bedrooms across California realized something was wrong. He turned toward the street just as the car doors opened. "Police! Don't move!" Davis hesitated for only a second. Then he tried to run. He sprinted toward the corner of the yard, but 2 officers were already closing in from the opposite direction. Within seconds, they tackled him to the ground. The struggle lasted only moments. Cold metal handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Davis lay face down on the grass, breathing hard but saying nothing. Detective Reynolds approached slowly. For months, he had imagined the face of the man responsible for the murders of 5 couples. Now he was finally standing over him. Daniel Davis looked up from the ground. His expression was strangely calm, almost indifferent. Reynolds crouched beside him. "You know why we're here," the detective said quietly. Davis didn't answer. Across the street, lights were beginning to turn on in neighboring houses as curious residents looked out their windows. They had no idea how close their quiet neighborhood had come to becoming the next crime scene. Officers pulled Davis to his feet and led him toward the police car. But Reynolds knew the arrest was only the beginning. They still needed proof. Real evidence tying him to the murders across California. And if their suspicions were right, that evidence was waiting somewhere inside Daniel Davis's home. The morning after Daniel Davis was arrested, detectives arrived at his rented house on the outskirts of Bakersfield with a search warrant. The small 1-story home looked ordinary from the outside. A dusty pickup truck still sat in the driveway, and the yard was patchy with dry grass and weeds. Nothing about the place suggested the man who lived there had terrorized communities across California. But Detective Michael Reynolds had learned long ago that the most disturbing secrets were often hidden behind the most ordinary doors. 2 officers stepped inside first. The house was quiet. A small living room held a worn couch, a television set, and a coffee table stacked with old newspapers. Everything appeared neat, almost carefully arranged. "Start with the bedroom," Reynolds said. The search began slowly, methodically. Every drawer, every closet, every box. At first, the officers found very little: clothes, tools, receipts from gas stations and roadside diners. The kind of things you would expect from a man who traveled frequently for construction work. But then one of the detectives opened a metal toolbox stored in the bedroom closet. Inside were several small objects wrapped carefully in cloth. "Reynolds!" the detective called. The room fell silent as they unfolded the first piece of fabric. Inside was a gold wedding ring. Another cloth revealed a silver necklace. Then a third bundle revealed something even more disturbing, a woman's wristwatch, still faintly stained. Detective Reynolds stared at the items quietly. "These aren't random," he said. A technician carefully photographed each object. Within minutes, they found more. A cardboard box hidden under the bed contained several pieces of clothing that didn't belong to Davis. Women's blouses, a man's belt, and a pair of small earrings. Each item was labeled and sealed into evidence bags. But the most chilling discovery came from the small desk in the corner of the room. Inside the drawer was a folded road map of California. Red pen marks covered several cities along Highway 99. Sacramento, Fresno, Stockton, Modesto, Visalia. Every city where a couple had been murdered. Detective Angela Morales leaned over the desk, studying the map carefully. "He marked them," she said quietly. Next to the map sat a small notebook. Reynolds opened it slowly. Inside were short handwritten notes, dates, street names, descriptions. Couple, mid-20s. Lights off around 11. Kitchen window open. Each entry looked like surveillance observations. Each one matched addresses connected to the murdered couples. For a moment, the entire room was silent. They had spent months trying to prove the existence of a traveling killer. Now the proof was sitting right in front of them. Reynolds closed the notebook slowly. "That's it," he said. Later that afternoon, investigators began contacting the families of the victims. The jewelry and clothing found inside Davis's house were identified as belongings of Mark and Emily Carter, Kevin and Laura Bennett, Jason and Nicole Ramirez, Brian and Melissa Turner, and Eric and Hannah Collins. 5 couples, 10 victims, all connected to the man now sitting in a holding cell at the Bakersfield Police Department. When detectives finally questioned Daniel Davis that evening, he listened calmly as the evidence was laid out in front of him. The map, the notebook, the jewelry, the clothing. For several minutes he said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the table. The investigation that had begun with a quiet house in Sacramento was finally complete. All that remained now was the final stage of the case, the courtroom. The trial of Daniel Davis began in the spring of 1991 at the Kern County Superior Court in Bakersfield. By then, the case had drawn attention across California. Newspapers that once printed small articles about the murders now covered every step of the trial. For months, communities across the Central Valley had lived with the fear of an unknown killer moving silently through their neighborhoods. Now that man sat at the defense table. Daniel Davis looked almost exactly the way he had the night of his arrest. Calm, quiet, and expressionless. He wore a plain gray suit provided by his attorneys and kept his hands folded neatly in front of him. Nothing about his appearance suggested the violence prosecutors described, but the evidence told a very different story. The courtroom was filled with reporters, detectives, and the families of the victims. Many of them had traveled from different cities across California to see the man responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. The prosecution began by outlining the pattern of the murders: young married couples, quiet neighborhoods, nighttime attacks, homes entered without forced entry. Detective Michael Reynolds was one of the first witnesses called to the stand. He spent hours explaining how the investigation connected crime scenes across multiple cities. Using maps and photographs, Reynolds showed the jury how the killings followed a path along Highway 99, stretching from Sacramento to Visalia. Then came the physical evidence. Investigators presented the map found in Davis's house, marked with the cities where the murders occurred. They showed the notebook containing surveillance notes including street names and descriptions of the victims' homes. Finally, the prosecution displayed the items recovered from Davis's bedroom closet: the gold wedding ring, the silver necklace, the watch, the clothing. One by one, family members of the victims identified the belongings. The courtroom grew heavy with emotion as the parents of Emily Carter described the necklace she wore every day. A sister of Melissa Turner identified the earrings found in the evidence box. Even the most reserved jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the reality of the crimes became impossible to ignore. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence had been misinterpreted, that the items could have been collected randomly, that the notebook entries proved nothing. But the prosecution's timeline was too precise. Each note in the notebook matched a real address. Each marked city on the map matched a murder, and witnesses placed a dark blue pickup truck near several crime scenes. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Robert Keller, the Visalia neighbor who had seen Davis leaving the yard that night, took the stand. He pointed directly at Davis. "That's the man I saw," Keller said firmly. The courtroom fell silent. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, the room filled with tension. Daniel Davis sat motionless as the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder. Several members of the victims' families began to cry quietly. Others simply stared at the man who had shattered so many lives. At the sentencing hearing, the judge spoke slowly and firmly. For the calculated and deliberate murders of these innocent victims, the court sentences Daniel Davis to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Davis showed no reaction. He was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, disappearing through the same door used by dozens of convicted criminals before him. Outside, reporters gathered as detectives and prosecutors spoke briefly to the media. Detective Reynolds stepped away from the cameras and looked toward the courthouse steps. The case that had begun with a quiet house on Willow Creek Drive was finally over. 10 lives had been lost. 5 homes had been forever changed. But the man responsible would never walk free again. And across the neighborhoods of California's Central Valley, the lights in quiet houses could once again turn off at night without fear of the man in the pickup truck.